Dale had always been fascinated by human interaction. It wasn't just about small talk or surface-level charm. It was about the deeper rhythm of influence, the kind that could change hearts, shift conversations, and transform relationships. As he watched people navigate their lives, careers, and communities, Dale realized that success often didn't belong to the most talented or the most intelligent. It belonged to those who understood people. He began noticing how the smallest behaviors created the biggest ripple effects. A kind word, a thoughtful compliment, or a sincere question could open doors where qualifications alone could not. Dale didn't come from wealth or privilege. His early life in Missouri had taught him the value of hard work and observation. He studied human nature like a scientist studies elements, analyzing, recording, and experimenting. And over time, he started piecing together a philosophy of connection. There was a time Dale sat in the corner of a New York cafe, watching a businessman berate a waiter for a late order. The businessman's voice rose, drawing the attention of nearby tables. The waiter, flustered and nervous, apologized repeatedly. But Dale's focus wasn't on the man shouting. It was on the couple at the next table, how their faces shifted from interest to discomfort. That moment cemented a truth Dale had sensed for years. Criticism was cheap, but kindness had compound interest. As he moved into the world of teaching public speaking, Dale found his greatest classroom wasn't a lecture hall. It was real life. His students were professionals, salesmen, homemakers, clerks. They came in to learn how to speak well, but stayed because Dale taught them how to connect, to be remembered, and to make others feel important. One evening, Dale sat with a young insurance agent named Jim who was frustrated by his inability to close deals. Jim had memorized his pitch, studied the market, and knocked on hundreds of doors. Still, rejection followed him like a shadow. Dale listened patiently, then asked, "Jim, when you approach a client, do you talk about their needs or yours?" The question stunned Jim. His pitch was flawless, but it had always been about his goals, his commission, his company. Dale encouraged him to try something different. Before you talk business, find something to admire about the person. Be genuine. Ask about their interests, their family, their world. Jim hesitated, but he tried it. Within a month, his conversion rate tripled. The difference? He was no longer selling, he was connecting. Dale's observations coalesced into a core principle. People crave appreciation, not flattery, not manipulation, but sincere recognition. He remembered a night when he complimented an elevator operator on his cheerful smile. The man lit up, explaining how few people even looked at him, let alone spoke to him. That smile, Dale realized, wasn't just a facial expression. It was a lifeline of dignity in a job that often felt invisible. The power of names fascinated Dale. In one of his training sessions, he told his students that a person's name is, to them, the sweetest sound in any language. He shared the story of a receptionist named Martha who had worked at the same office for 20 years. Most clients barely noticed her. One day, a visiting executive greeted her by name. Her posture changed. Her voice lifted. That single gesture of acknowledgement stayed with her for weeks. Dale urged his students to learn and use people's names, not as a trick, but as a sign of respect. There was a story Dale loved to tell about a man named Charles Schwab, the steel magnate. Schwab was known not just for his business acumen, but for his ability to inspire loyalty in his employees. Once, a foreman was underperforming. Rather than scold him, Schwab picked up a piece of chalk and wrote the number 6 on the floor. When the morning shift came in, they asked what it meant. The foreman explained that only 6 heats had been produced that day. The next day, the number 8 appeared. Productivity soared, not through punishment, but through challenge and pride. In Dale's mind, people responded not to commands, but to purpose. He watched how great leaders influenced others by appealing to their sense of meaning. Lincoln, one of Dale's idols, rarely attacked others publicly. When someone criticized Lincoln for not being more aggressive with his generals, Lincoln replied, "Don't criticize them. They're doing the best they can." It wasn't weakness, it was perspective. One of Dale's most vivid memories came from a time he tried to change someone's mind through argument. It was a debate about politics, and Dale came prepared with facts, statistics, and confidence. He won the argument, but lost the friendship. That night, alone in his room, he realized that winning a point and winning a person were two different things. He began to understand that the best way to win an argument was to avoid it. He taught this in his classes. When people are wrong, they don't want to be told. They want to be understood. He encouraged his students to listen first, to nod, to ask questions. When someone feels heard, their defenses soften. Dale once visited a factory where two managers were in constant conflict. Instead of asking them to work together, he asked each one to explain the other's perspective. After 15 minutes of honest listening, their tone shifted. They didn't agree on everything, but they began to collaborate. Dale believed that influence was about planting seeds of thought, not hammering people with ideas. He told the story of a marketing executive who wanted his team to embrace a new strategy. Rather than declare it, he framed it as a question. What do you think would happen if we tried this approach? The team explored it, debated it, and eventually adopted it, because it became their idea. He also understood the power of admitting one's own faults. In one seminar, he recalled a moment when he arrived late to a meeting. Rather than make excuses, he simply said, "Gentlemen, I was careless with my time." The room relaxed. People are more forgiving when you disarm them with honesty. Dale's days were spent collecting these human moments. In train stations, lobbies, classrooms, he observed, recorded, and reflected. His notebooks filled with stories of clerks, drivers, executives, and waiters. Each one offered a lesson in empathy, communication, or leadership. He once walked into a barbershop and found two men arguing about baseball. The older man insisted a certain player had hit 60 home runs in one season. The younger man disagreed. Dale watched as voices rose. Then the barber chimed in, "You might be right, sir, but wasn't it amazing how consistent he was all year?" The tension broke. The older man smiled, nodding. That barber hadn't proved a point. He had preserved a relationship. Dale internalized a rule. Never begin by announcing someone is wrong. It creates resistance. Instead, guide them to reconsider through their own reasoning. He advised his students to begin conversations with praise, follow with questions, and conclude with encouragement. One afternoon, Dale met a woman named Susan, who worked in a large publishing house. She struggled with her supervisor, who was cold and dismissive. Dale suggested a subtle shift. What's one thing he does well? Susan thought hard, then mentioned his attention to detail. The next day, she told him she appreciated how he caught things others missed. His demeanor changed. Over the following weeks, their dynamic thawed. Dale smiled when she told him. It felt like I unlocked a different version of him. He reminded his students, people often become what we expect of them. If we treat someone as rude or careless, they mirror it. But if we expect patience and capability, they often rise to it. Dale wasn't preaching fantasy. He was describing patterns, ones he had tested over decades. When Dale sat down to write, he wasn't compiling theories. He was building a guidebook from lived stories. Each page carried echoes of real people, real challenges, and real change. He wove together threads of psychology, experience, and common sense, shaping a philosophy that resonated across industries and generations. As the sun set outside his study window, Dale looked over the pages on his desk. He knew he wasn't offering magic, but in a world hungry for connection, he was offering tools. Timeless tools that, when used sincerely, could transform not just careers, but lives. And so, he wrote, with care, with humility, with the belief that anyone, absolutely anyone, could learn how to win friends and influence people. In the months that followed, Dale began compiling more examples, weaving stories that brought principles to life. He never wanted to write a dry manual filled with theories. He wanted readers to feel the heartbeat behind human behavior. His mission was to guide people toward becoming better listeners, more thoughtful communicators, and stronger influencers. One of his favorite examples came from an evening gala hosted by a major corporation. A man named Michael, new to the executive team, found himself seated next to a prominent author. Instead of trying to impress her with credentials, Michael asked about her writing process. She spoke with passion, detail, and energy for nearly an hour. The next morning, she told a colleague, "Michael is one of the most interesting people I've ever met." He had barely spoken about himself. That was Dale's lesson. Being genuinely interested in others was far more powerful than trying to be interesting. As Dale continued his journey, he found that most people weren't selfish out of malice. They simply lived inside their own heads. They wanted to be heard, appreciated, and understood. If someone could step outside of themselves and focus on others, they'd hold an invisible key that unlocked hearts. He remembered a hardware store clerk named Eddie who managed to outsell everyone else on the team. The secret? Eddie greeted every customer by name and asked about their last purchase. "How's that paint holding up?" Or, "Did the new drill do the job?" Eddie wasn't just selling tools, he was creating relationships. People returned not for the price, but for the experience of being remembered. Dale taught that even in disagreement, respect must remain. He once told the story of a heated conversation between two professors debating evolution. Instead of dismissing the other's view, one professor said, "That's a fascinating perspective I hadn't considered. Can you explain more?" The other paused, surprised. A potential argument became a dialogue. No one's mind was changed that night, but both left with mutual admiration. In Dale's seminars, he introduced an exercise that changed the way people listened. He asked one person to speak for 5 minutes about something they loved, a hobby, a memory, a person. The listener was not allowed to interrupt, advise, or judge, only to nod and make encouraging expressions. When it ended, the speaker often said, "I felt so understood." That's when Dale would explain that the magic wasn't in solving a problem, it was in simply making someone feel heard. There was power in asking questions that invited others to talk, not just surface-level ones, but questions rooted in curiosity. Dale recalled a dinner party where a man asked a fellow guest, "What inspired you to pursue architecture?" The question opened up a window into childhood dreams, favorite buildings, and forgotten passions. Everyone listened, drawn in by a story that would have remained hidden if not for a thoughtful question. Another key insight Dale emphasized was the value of never using force to win someone over. He often cited the story of a young saleswoman named Laura who was tasked with reviving a failing client account. Her predecessor had bombarded the client with emails, proposals, and reminders. Laura instead sent a handwritten note thanking the client for their past trust and asking what she could do to better serve them. The reply came the next day. Within a week, the account was active again. The difference? Laura had led with humility and understanding. Dale encouraged people to admit when they were wrong. In one anecdote, a store manager named Greg had blamed his assistant for a missed shipment. But later, Greg discovered it was his own oversight. Rather than avoid the topic, he called the assistant and said, "I was wrong. I should have double-checked the schedule. I apologize." The assistant's respect for Greg grew, and their working relationship became stronger than ever. Even when giving feedback, Dale urged people to start with praise. He recounted the story of a violin teacher named Mrs. Anderson. When her student played off-key, she didn't begin with correction. Instead, she smiled and said, "You held that note longer than last time. Great control. Now let's see if we can make the pitch even sweeter." The student's face lit up. With encouragement as the foundation, criticism became a bridge, not a wall. Over time, Dale's reputation grew. People from all walks of life, managers, parents, students, entrepreneurs, attended his courses. They came seeking tactics but left with transformation. He reminded them that leadership was not about control, but about influence. Not about commanding, but about connecting. He once met a young woman named Angela who worked in retail. She struggled with a difficult coworker named Todd. Everyone avoided him. He was sarcastic, short-tempered, and cynical. Angela decided to try something Dale had taught. She began noticing little things Todd did right and casually complimented him. "You're really fast at organizing stock," she said once. Another time, "I noticed you stayed late to help yesterday. That was kind." Slowly, Todd's demeanor softened. Months later, he thanked her. "No one ever saw anything good in me here. You did." Dale's joy came from stories like these. Not grand gestures, but small, deliberate changes in behavior that rewired relationships. He often reminded his students that every human being wore an invisible sign that read, "Make me feel important." Those who noticed that sign and responded to it found doors opening in every part of life. His notebooks filled with handwritten stories, doormen, CEOs, janitors, politicians, all weaving a common thread. People responded best when they felt valued. He remembered the janitor of a building he visited often. Most people passed him without a glance. One morning, Dale greeted him warmly and asked about his family. The man lit up. The next week, Dale noticed the lobby had been polished extra clean. When he asked why, the janitor said, "You noticed me. I wanted to do something extra." Dale saw those ripples everywhere, in marriages, in classrooms, in boardrooms. The art of influence was not manipulation. It was grounded in empathy, a skill like any other that could be learned, practiced, and refined. He also cautioned against rushing to prove someone wrong. In one conversation with a businessman, Dale recounted how he'd been corrected on a historical date by a friend. His instinct was to argue, but instead he said, "You might be right." Later, he checked and found his own memory had failed him. Had he argued, he would have damaged a friendship and still ended up wrong. That moment taught him humility. He often said that letting someone save face was one of the kindest things we can do. During a team presentation, a junior analyst misquoted a report. The manager, instead of pointing it out publicly, corrected it later in private and praised the analyst for her preparation. She grew more confident and eventually led the next meeting herself. A small decision had a large consequence. Dale noticed that even animals understood the power of praise. He shared how trainers at circuses didn't beat lions into submission, they rewarded them with meat for every desired behavior. That principle applied just as much to people. Encouragement, not condemnation, produced results. He encouraged his students to catch others doing something right. Too often people waited to criticize but forgot to affirm. One business owner implemented a practice of writing one thank you note a day to his employees. Within months, productivity and morale had soared. People didn't work harder out of fear. They worked harder because they felt seen. Dale also believed in inspiring desire rather than issuing commands. A father once told him about trying to get his son to clean his room. Yelling had failed. Bribes hadn't worked. So instead, he showed his son pictures of cool room designs and asked, "How do you want your room to look?" The boy engaged. Within a week, he was organizing and even asking for help decorating. The shift? It wasn't about forcing behavior, it was about guiding a vision. Through every story, every interaction, Dale's philosophy became clear. If you want people to follow you, start by following them. Understand their dreams, their fears, their priorities. Influence begins with empathy. By now, Dale's courses had touched thousands. But he never stopped learning. In one seminar, an older man raised his hand and said, "I've spent 40 years in business. I thought I knew people, but I realized I never really listened to them." That evening, the man called his daughter and simply asked how she was. She cried on the phone. "You never ask that," she said. That night, Dale sat in silence, humbled. Every principle he had shared wasn't just about professional success. It was about healing, connection, and legacy. He believed that changing how we treat others could ripple across generations. And so, he kept writing. Not to preach, but to offer a mirror, to help people see what was possible when they led with warmth instead of ego, when they focused on listening instead of winning. It wasn't about being clever. It was about being kind, about showing up, seeing people, and inviting them to be their best. One word, one question, one smile at a time. The next morning, Dale walked through Central Park reflecting on how far his teachings had traveled. What began as lectures in cramped halls was now a philosophy echoing through boardrooms, family dinners, and even quiet morning commutes. Yet the essence of his work never changed. He didn't believe in shortcuts or manipulations. He believed in consistent, sincere behavior rooted in respect. As he watched a father helping his daughter feed ducks by the lake, he thought of how early these lessons could begin. Children, he believed, absorbed more from tone than words. When a child felt heard, they learned to listen. When they were praised, they developed self-respect. One of Dale's former students, a young teacher named Melissa, had written to him about how her classroom changed when she stopped scolding and started appreciating effort. Instead of saying, "You're wrong," she began with, "That's an interesting approach. Let's look at it together." The students grew braver, more curious, and more cooperative. In another part of the city, a restaurant manager named David had once struggled with high staff turnover. Inspired by Dale's book, David changed his approach. Every morning meeting began with recognition. "I saw Maria handle a difficult table with grace yesterday," or "Let's thank Jorge for staying late to help with inventory." Within 3 months, the restaurant saw record-level staff retention. David told Dale later, "People didn't leave for more money. They stayed for more meaning." One story Dale treasured involved a letter from a father named Ben, who had always been critical of his teenage son. Their relationship had grown cold. After reading Dale's thoughts on appreciation, Ben wrote a simple note to his son. "I admire how you think. I may not always show it, but I see your intelligence and your kindness." The son never replied directly, but weeks later, He began joining his father at breakfast again. Connection doesn't need grand gestures. Sometimes it begins with a note. Dale kept emphasizing that the deepest craving of human nature is the desire to be appreciated. It wasn't about compliments for the sake of it. It was about noticing what others bring to the world and saying it out loud. One small business owner named Clara implemented a gratitude bell in her office. Every time a team member did something helpful, someone could ring the bell and say why. It felt silly at first, but soon became the heartbeat of the office. When Dale shared stories like these in his seminars, the energy in the room shifted. People leaned forward, scribbled notes, and raised their hands to share their own transformations. A taxi driver once stood up and said, "I started opening the door for passengers and asking about their day. My tips doubled in 2 weeks." Even in conflict, Dale taught that appreciation could redirect energy. He recalled a couple who attended one of his weekend workshops. They argued constantly, picking at each other with sharp words. Dale asked them to spend one day noticing what the other did right and writing it down. By evening, they were laughing. The husband said, "I forgot she makes my coffee every morning without fail." The wife replied, "And I forgot how he warms the car for me in winter." These things were never gone. They had just gone unnoticed. Dale often repeated that being right was less important than being kind. He told of a librarian named George who overheard 2 patrons disputing over who wrote War and Peace. George knew the answer but held his tongue, sensing the rising tension. Later, he approached gently and asked if he could offer a clarification. The men smiled and one said, "Thanks for not embarrassing us." George hadn't just preserved ego. He preserved respect. One quiet evening, Dale sat by his fireplace and reviewed an old letter from a woman named Evelyn. She had been struggling with a demanding supervisor who dismissed her ideas. Rather than confront him, she tried one of Dale's suggestions. She asked him for advice. "You have more experience in this field than anyone I know. What would you do in my position?" The supervisor softened. That single question transformed their dynamic. From adversaries, they became collaborators. Dale underlined a phrase from the letter. "When I asked for help, I gave him a chance to be wise." That was it. When people feel trusted, they become trustworthy. When they feel wise, they act with wisdom. He saw this principle everywhere. In the way an older brother coached his younger sibling with patience. In the way a boss gave credit to his team. In the way a manager asked a janitor's opinion on how to streamline cleaning schedules. It wasn't charity, it was strategy rooted in humanity. And then there was the art of encouraging others to talk about themselves. Dale saw this not as flattery, but as a bridge to deeper connection. One evening at a networking event, he watched a man named Patrick move through the room without talking about himself once. He asked others about their careers, dreams, and hobbies. By the end of the night, everyone remembered him. Not because he had boasted, but because he had listened. Another story came from a letter Dale received from a woman named Nora who had used his teachings to build her business. "I used to try and convince people," she wrote. "Now I ask them about their lives, their needs, their fears. People trust me more. They buy because they feel seen." Dale smiled. It wasn't charm, it was care. He always taught that making the other person feel important, and doing it sincerely, was a master key to influence. Not with hollow praise, but with recognition that came from truly seeing the person behind the role. He told the story of a train conductor who remembered passengers' names. A businessman, after one trip, said, "That conductor made me feel like a person, not just a ticket." Dale used this to emphasize that jobs weren't about tasks. They were about relationships. Any job, no matter how routine, could be transformed through the lens of human dignity. One afternoon, Dale sat in a small park and watched a man scold his dog for not obeying a command. He yelled and tugged the leash. The dog cowered. Moments later, another dog owner passed by, using gentle praise and tiny treats to guide her puppy. Dale smiled. The first dog was afraid. The second was eager to learn. The same applied to people. Encouragement wasn't just moral, it was practical. It worked. In story after story, from factories to schools to marriages, Dale found that positive reinforcement moved people further than punishment ever could. He also believed that good intentions meant little without execution. Sincerity, he would say, has to be active. A compliment not given, a thank you not spoken, a name not remembered. These were lost opportunities. Dale had met a man named Eric. a car dealership owner who transformed his entire customer experience after reading How to Win Friends and Influence People. Instead of focusing on quotas, Eric focused on relationships. Salesmen were trained to remember birthdays, ask about families, and follow up after a sale, not to pitch again, but to check in. Within a year, referrals made up over 70% of their business. Dale noted, "He didn't find new customers. He created new friends." Dale's mailbox filled each month with stories like Eric's. People who weren't just succeeding, they were transforming their environments. A teacher who replaced red ink with handwritten encouragement. A nurse who comforted patients with quiet stories instead of clinical updates. A police officer who de-escalated tension by calling someone sir when no one else had. Dale felt deep pride in these stories, not because they praised his book, but because they proved something larger. The world didn't need more force. It needed more understanding. He understood that some might dismiss these techniques as soft or idealistic, but to him they were powerful tools that shaped reality. He wasn't suggesting that people be fake or manipulative. Quite the opposite. He urged authenticity, just the kind that noticed others, uplifted others, and helped others shine. Dale always believed that in helping others win, you win too, that the spotlight never dims when shared. And so he continued writing, speaking, and teaching. Not with grand promises, but with gentle truths. Influence wasn't lightning, it was warmth. And in a cold world, warmth could be revolutionary. One spring evening, Dale sat in a quiet library, surrounded by the letters he had received from readers across the world. Some were written in perfect penmanship, others hurried and emotional, but all shared one theme: change. Not the kind born from grand achievements, but the subtle kind, the kind that takes place in human hearts. A woman named Teresa had written about her strained relationship with her teenage daughter. They argued often, mostly over little things: chores, curfews, clothes. After reading Dale's advice on avoiding criticism and expressing appreciation, Teresa changed her approach. One day, instead of telling her daughter to clean her room, she said, "You have such a creative spirit. I love how you decorate your space." That same afternoon, her daughter began tidying the room, unprompted. Weeks later, their conversations were filled with more laughter than tension. Dale had never met Teresa, but he knew her story was one of millions. And in every one of them, the same principle emerged. Respect, kindness, and a willingness to listen could transform even the most difficult situations. There was another letter that stood out. A retired Army officer named Harold, who struggled with civilian life. He found it hard to connect with neighbors and co-workers. He felt out of place, misunderstood. Then, one day, after someone dismissed one of his stories, Harold remembered a line from Dale's book: "If you want to be interesting, be interested." That day, he started asking others about their stories. He discovered that his neighbors weren't cold. They were just never invited to open up. In time, Harold became the heart of his community. Dale believed deeply that people didn't need to change who they were to connect with others. They simply needed to shift how they related. He once shared that in his early years, he too was prone to lecturing, to proving his point. But over time, he discovered that leading with humility opened far more doors than leading with certainty. He remembered a radio host who invited him for an interview. Before they went on air, the host said, "I've read your book. I'm skeptical. Aren't you just teaching people to manipulate others?" Dale smiled gently and replied, "If you treat people with dignity only to get something from them, it won't last. But if you do it because you value them, it changes everything." The interview ended with a handshake and a sincere thank you. Dale never shied away from calling out the misuse of his teachings. Influence, he said, was never about control. It was about connection. A company executive once bragged about using Dale's techniques to close major deals. But when Dale asked how those clients felt afterward, the executive couldn't answer. That, Dale warned, was not influence. That was trickery, and trickery always collapses. He emphasized that people are not problems to be solved, they are stories to be heard. He told of a shy boy named Martin who had few friends in school. A teacher, inspired by Dale's ideas, asked Martin to help set up the classroom every morning. Over time, Martin began to smile more. Other students joined him. That simple act of trust and responsibility gave Martin the confidence to open up, and by the end of the year, he was class president. Dale often said that when you elevate someone else, you rise too. One compliment could echo for years. One apology could mend a family. One question could change a life. Even the smallest interaction could matter. He remembered standing in line at a post office behind a tired-looking clerk. The people ahead of him were impatient. When it was his turn, Dale simply said, "You handle this rush with so much patience." The clerk looked up, surprised, then smiled. "Thank you. Most people just yell." She breathed easier, and the line behind Dale moved faster, not because anything changed externally, but because one person had chosen to see another. In his final teachings, Dale reminded people to choose their words like architects design bridges, with care, with foresight, and with the intent to connect. Words could tear down or lift up. They could push people away or bring them closer. He told the story of a CEO who transformed his entire leadership style by adopting one phrase, "What do you think?" This simple question, asked consistently, turned passive employees into active contributors. It made people feel involved, heard, and valued. Within a year, the company saw record engagement scores. Dale called it the magic of inclusion. Even in his personal life, Dale lived his philosophy. His home was a space of warmth and curiosity. Visitors noted how he asked questions and truly listened, not out of politeness, but out of genuine care. A friend once said, "Being around Dale made you feel like the most important person in the room." He knew that in the end, people wouldn't remember your title, your wealth, or your speeches. They would remember how you made them feel. Did they feel respected? Did they feel uplifted? Did they feel heard? He once met a janitor named Luis who told him, "I don't have a big job, but I make sure everyone who walks by me gets a smile." Dale shook his hand and said, "Then you have one of the biggest jobs in the world." As Dale grew older, he reflected on a lifetime of lessons. He had traveled the world, taught thousands, and influenced millions. But the essence of his work remained beautifully simple. Be kind, be sincere, be curious. He never claimed to be perfect. He had lost tempers, made poor judgments, and hurt feelings. But each time, he had returned to the same principles. Admit your fault, apologize with humility, and try again. Influence wasn't about never making mistakes. It was about how you responded when you did. One day, while giving a final seminar, he looked out at the faces before him and said, "Remember this, people may forget what you said, but they will never forget how you made them feel." The room was silent. The weight of those words sank in. He continued, "You don't need to shout to be heard. You don't need to fight to be strong. You don't need to control to lead." He paused, letting the message land. The room erupted in applause, not for the show, but for the truth. And so, Dale's legacy lived on, not just in books, but in actions, in thank yous spoken, in names remembered, in criticisms withheld, in genuine compliments given. His work was never about fame, it was about heart. And in the quiet moments between people, at dinner tables, in waiting rooms, across office desks, his teachings breathed. For every time someone chose understanding over judgment, listening over lecturing, encouragement over criticism, Dale Carnegie smiled somewhere. Because he knew. This was how we win friends. This was how we influence people. Not with power, but with presence. Not with tricks, but with truth. Not with force, but with grace. Thank you for joining us on this deep and transformative journey. In a world racing forward at lightning speed, the only true advantage is the ability to adapt, to grow, and to learn continuously. We hope this audiobook inspired you to challenge your comfort zone, embrace reflection, and become a lifelong learner. If this resonated with you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Victory Think, your destination for powerful book insights, one story at a time. Stay curious, keep evolving, and see you in the next story.